obstructions. I don't think lawyers help an awful lot most of the time. And I think that's how I make a living, but it's really unhelpful. There's the sort of, we don't have to do that, our legal told us so, is another one of those shoot the process in the head kind of lines. Or we have a legal opinion, we can't share it with you, but we can't do that, is another sort of shoot it in the head kind of line. We don't really know, we're just making, I mean, it's incredibly unhelpful because it disempowers the table, right? And maybe I don't know if I'm talking about negotiation or co-development right now, but I think you need to find ways to empower the table and make the table and all of its members be the people who are going to find the solution. And if you say, sorry, that's not in our mandate, the minister crafted it, it's out of our hands, the table's disempowered. If you say, sorry, legal said we can't do that, or we don't have to do that, or they don't want us to do that, you've disempowered the table. And so maybe, I mean, and this is sort of only coming to me now as I say it, but maybe the biggest problems and the biggest solution are the same things, which is identifying ways to empower the table to find the solutions that work for the problem the table is confronting, whether it's developing a policy or a piece of legislation or negotiating a treaty for that matter. But empower the table to do the work the table needs to do. And anytime you find yourselves dealing with tools or obstacles which are outside the table, I think those are the things which undermine goodwill and undermine the table's confidence that it actually can do that difficult thing that we're almost invariably trying to do. So I mean, I could come up with other concerns, but I think those for me really are the central problems.
Frank, do you want to?
Yeah.
Obstacles?
Well, I think, and I think for, I think some of the SGIGs, the modern trees, I think they can be those obstacles as well. I think, when we're talking about in the BC context, and, if Canada and BC are looking to the BC Leadership Council as the authority on modern treaties in the province, without having consulted with modern treaties, that's an issue. And potentially that is not just BC and Canada. That's a modern treaty issue as well, and an SGIG issue. So if we're talking about collaboration, and we're talking about to have that ability to be able to be in that relationship, so that you can have those discussions with each other, instead of thumbing your nose at the process. And so that, I think that's one way, and that's been an obstacle. And so, and I hope that, and I say this tongue in cheek, but and again, there are a few people in the room that know that I've now been doing presentations around BC and Vancouver, particularly, to take away that misconception. So we're here, we're able to tell you that this is how this works and stuff. And so, and part of that is by going to the negotiating groups in BC and explaining the whole fiscal policy process and how it's worked. It's having those BC treaty transformation talks with the province. It's having those fiscal policy discussion tables, much like we had with Canada. So the obstacle that comes with that, though, is not from the modern treaty perspective, but it's from the province now not so sure about fiscal policy, right? And so when you say it works, this is what we've done with Canada, and it works with, and there shouldn't be that much difference, and so you get a little bit of pushback. We did this exercise a few weeks ago with the Alliance of Modern Treaties, where Manolf looked at all BC's obligations, and we were asking the other 7 treaty nations of the alliance to do their obligations. And but once we were in receipt of Manol's, I said to the meeting, we can't do this. We're going to scare the shit out of BC. If every single one of us lists our obligations under the treaty, it's going to scare them in this whole treaty process, because they're going to be looking at, we need to choose that 2 or 3 or 4 treaty obligations that that we can have those initial beginning talks. But if we slam them with those, Emily, if we slam them with those, all of those responsibilities, it's going to scare them. And so, and I think, going to the national collaborative fiscal policy stuff, and again, I've got to say this tongue in cheek, but it's seemingly to be a real huge slowdown. And when you've had 25, 26 modern treaties that have renewed their FTAs or FFAs, and the difference between an Indian Act FFA and FTA to now an actual proper document that some of these nations, these SGIGs, have anywhere from 250 to 300% increases in their governance spending. Again, it scared the shit out of Treasury Board. So there's been a huge slowdown in the process to get those remaining annexes and buckets done under a minority government. So the minority government is also the cause for some of these issues and delays. But there's one other one here, but I can't read my writing.
Thanks. I just have a follow-up question. I'm thinking about the few legislations that came out of the last federal parliament, Indigenous policy-related legislation, that there were attempts at co-developing, some of them successful, some of them less so. I'm wondering if it's the process of co-developing that is important, or the end result, or both, in the sense that, and where I'm getting at here is some of you mentioned this idea of consultation versus consent in that context. Do we all need to agree at the end? For it to be co-development, do we all need to agree at the end on the end result? Or is it still co-development, and can it still be called a success if in the end we don't quite agree, but a legislation or a policy is still adopted? In other words, do we need unanimity? Do we need complete agreement on everything? Or where does it stop to be a collaborative process?
I mean, it's dangerous ground we're getting onto. Not that it's unimportant ground, but I think it's dangerous ground. I mean, certainly consensus, but not necessarily unanimity, is often how I look at it. But and the reason I say it's dangerous ground is because you need, in my experience and in my view, you need to create space where nobody feels that somebody has the final say, right? Because if there's a sense that we're going to engage in this process, but ultimately they get to say what the final product is. Once you believe that to be the case, it's very, very difficult for the process of co-development to work effectively. But at the same time, obviously, it can't be a case where one group or another gets a pocket veto, right? But by being obstructionist or recalcitrant on one point or another point, preventing consensus from developing, that one group with an agenda which maybe isn't shared with the table as a whole can prevent something from progressing or being finalized. And so again, it's hard to try to pin it down and to try to articulate it. Not that it's not important to do so, because as soon as you try to say, well, do we all have to have complete agreement? What does that look like? How do we define that? What does consensus look like? What does unanimity look like? You start to create the risk of people sort of, the terrifying V word, right? Veto starts floating around, and veto's a terrible word that nobody should ever use ever again about anything. But it starts to float around, and then all of a sudden, everybody gets very twitchy. And so when it's working, I think when we had a prep call, there's a line from an American Supreme Court justice named Potter Stewart, when he was asked about obscenity. He said, "I can't define it, but I know it when I see it." And to some extent, I think for me, that really does need to be the spirit that informs these processes. And that's not a dodge, Martin. That's really that I think we need to be working towards consensus. But if we try too hard to precisely circumscribe where exactly consensus lies, we may already be setting the process up for failure.
Do you have comments on this, Mark or Frank?
I think Neri stated it very well. Maybe I'll point to the Commission obtained a legal opinion a couple of years ago on what free and prior informed consent is in the context of treaty negotiations. And in that legal opinion by an outside firm, Blake Castles, Graydon, Blake's, they found that free prior informed consent is not necessarily a veto, but it can be a veto. So I think that's the only other comment I would add, that it doesn't, veto is not a good word, I agree, but it has to be there. So it has to be possible for the Indigenous partners to say no. And what does that mean? I don't know, but I think in the context of co-development, there has to be the ability to say no, we don't agree with this. So, thank you.
Frank?
They both said it. Yeah, nothing to add.
Perfect, sounds good. Are you thinking of the potential for further development of collaborative processes and co-development? I'm wondering, are you an optimistic, or are you an optimist, or are you a pessimist, in the sense that are we heading into a direction where there's going to be more co-development, or is this a window of opportunity that was created by circumstances, by a new federal government that bred new dynamism into relationships, or federal or territorial or provincial governments, or in other words, is this circumstantial, or is this something that's going to be there permanently? And if so, then my second question, I guess, is you've all insisted on the fact that it requires a lot of this kind of secret, the magical solution to getting this working is really about attitudes and approaching this the proper way. But for attitudes to stay like that, it's difficult, right? Because it's about personality, it's about circumstances. And so is it possible to make this a systematic, a more institutionalized way of doing things? Or is it just circumstantial? In other words, going back to my initial question, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Mark, do you want to start? Yeah.
I guess I would probably fall towards optimism. It's a tool. It's an important tool. If it can change attitudes, I think it's for sure positive. If it can create greater flexibility and creativity on the government side, I think that's great. It remains to be seen. I think time is another challenge. Not everything can be co-developed, and we see that at some of the negotiations that I sit at, where they're trying to close in a year. They've all agreed to do that, but you can't co-develop everything in a year, and not everybody's going to be at that table to actually do co-develop things. But we have seen it already in operation in British Columbia. We've seen a couple of significant mandates that have changed as a result. One was, I mentioned earlier, was around the legal certainty. That's some new language that will be part of the treaty negotiations. which is more centered around rights recognition of rights and title, making it abundantly clear that there'll be no extinguishment. I think those are all positives, and they happen because of this new attitude around co-development.
Frank, optimistic or pessimistic?
You know, I'm optimistic, you know, and I agree with what Mark says. It's not, you know, it took us 3.5 years to get to the Green Book and to the two annexes that we were able to develop. 3.5 years. It took 6 months to get 26 FFAs and FTAs renegotiated before the end of the fiscal year, which was also an amazing feat in itself. But those things become easier when your work prior and leading up to it is done as it should be done. It's not an easy course. You have to be in it for the long haul. But the results are going to be phenomenal, and we've still got quite a ways to go. But you know, I see quite a few people from Canada, even in this room, that have been a part of that process over the past 3.5 years, and they'll tell you the same. It's not easy, and it's hard, and there's a lot of time away from home. And there's even, you know, a few of those times we even met in Ottawa. So it makes, but it's the life we chose, right? And I wouldn't change it for anything. So yeah, I'm very optimistic. We've gone from straight 3 entrenched positions under negotiation to shared decision-making, co-development, collaboration. Well, it doesn't get any better than that, right? So.
Yeah, I think cautiously optimistic would be where I would come from on it. I think that some of the hardest problems are being solved now, which is demonstrating, particularly to the public service, that it's not scary. That actually it seems really scary before you've experienced it, before you've been through the process. It seems, well, how on earth could we ever do that? That's impossible. And you start listing logistical nightmare after logistical nightmare, and you talk yourself into a box, and you just want to hide under the bed. And I think that as we have successes around the country, things like Mark's been talking about in BC, the fiscal processes that Frank's been talking about, the legislative development processes that I talked about, the more successes we have under our collective belts, the more we defang that monster under the bed. The more we really reassure, particularly, much less the political level, but the public service, that this is doable, this is attainable, and actually, if it's done well, you get to dine out on this, because you have some big wins, some files where you have a lot of happy faces around the table, which will make your political masters, Indigenous or public government, happy, and which will advance your agenda. You'll get that piece of legislation through without opposition, the policy endorsed, whatever it may be. So I think that's probably the hardest problem that we confronted, was to demonstrate that it actually isn't as scary as you can make yourself think it is. But I do reflect back on where I started today, talking about some of the ways the duty to consult and the way it's been proceduralized and formalized and ultimately turned into a spreadsheet. And I think we have to be constantly vigilant. I think we have to really remember every time we enter into one of these processes what we're doing and why we're doing, and understanding the importance of trust and the importance of relationship, the importance of really good faith listening, all of those things that I think all of us have talked about today, because it can always slip away. And I think that if you allow it to become formalistic or legalistic or just a procedure or just a series of boxes that get checked, then I think that gains can be lost. So I think cautiously optimistic is where I am, but I think that the thing about cautious optimism, and sort of to Frank's point, we're all going to keep spending a lot of nights away from home because the work's not stopping anytime soon.
Thank you. Insightful comments, all of you. we still have about 15 minutes. I think if you're okay with that, I would open the floor for questions. If people have questions or comments in the audience, they're more than welcome. I think it would be great to open up the discussion. There's microphones. There's 2 microphones, one here, one here. So please come forward. Don't be shy or afraid. Yes, and please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. I'm neither shy nor afraid. My name is Ross Patty. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Implementation of Modern Treaties for Canada. First of all, I want to thank the panelists for what I thought was a really insightful discussion, and I like the way you organized it with the questions. So well done, Mr. Moderator. A couple of comments. I'm intrigued, Nuri, about your proposition that we don't delve too much into defining co-development. And I'm going to give that a lot more thought. So one of the units that reports to me is responsible to provide advice to the entire federal family on things like duty to accommodate, consultation, what co-development might or might not look like. And where you started and where you ended has been a full circle for me today, because you just said a few minutes ago, federal officials are fearful of this journey. And so what I'm trying to reconcile is, how do you allow space to move forward with all of the right things in mind, which is that this is about a relationship. In my case, it's about a long-term relationship. It's about trust. It's about mutual respect. But yet we do need to provide to the federal family an understanding about terminology, co-development, shared decision-making, engagement, duty to consult, collaboration. Those are all terms that actually have different meanings and different implications for the obligations for the federal family. So I'd be interested in kind of you maybe delving a little bit more into that, and maybe providing me from the federal government some advice. I was also intrigued about, Mark, nice to see you, by the way, your comment that there's also the issue of representation and participation. And so there are instances where the people that should be at the table are not at the table. And I think we need to peel back the layer of that onion and ask, why has that happened? Because I actually think in some cases it's unintentional. I think it's the haste of whatever organizing party has gone about trying to get this done by a certain deadline, and some people get omitted from it, which is not an excuse, but it's not perhaps malintended in some cases. So I think that's another element that needs to be really thought through. And the last one that we're very cognizant of is of engagement fatigue with our partners. And so as the federal family moves forward and the honor, the crown, and the duty to consult grows and grows and grows, we have to be cognizant that our partners, our First Nations partners, have capacity issues. They've got their own priorities. Their priorities are not necessarily our priorities. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'd really be interested in how you guys provide advice to us about sort of how we navigate through the lack of defining these terms.
What, nothing for me, Ross? You behaved.
Yeah, they're great questions, and I'd love to have a succinct one-paragraph answer, and I don't think there is one, and that's part of the problem. And I think, obviously, Ross, you've highlighted an unavoidable tension. I think it's an unavoidable tension sort of implicit with what I've been saying today, and probably with what we've been talking about generally, which is it's all well and good to stay away from making things procedural, making things formalized, making things legalistic, making things defined. But somebody who hasn't done it before has to get into a room and have some sense of what the hell they're supposed to do. And how do you do one without the other, or is it possible to do one without the other? I think it probably is, but you'll have to forgive me if I don't get it all to you this morning or this afternoon. I think that, we talk so much when we talk about modern treaties, we talk about spirit and intent, right? We talk about going beyond what's on the page into what the parties really meant, what's actually animating this agreement, and what's animating the relationship, which is established by or mediated by or reconciled through, whatever the language you want to use, this agreement. And I think that a similar approach, and again, I don't quite have it, and I'm not going to pretend that I can easily wrap my arms around it and put it in a box for you. But I think that trying to understand the spirit and intent of the process that Indigenous governments and federal and provincial and territorial officials are engaged in is a really important starting point. And I think that defining the role, the objective, the process, the marching orders, whatever, through a lens of spirit and intent of what the process is, right? It's really it's to develop something together. It's to solve those problems in a collective way, in a way which isn't defined by competing interests or oppositional poles, but is defined in relationship. And again, we can get flaky as anything pretty quickly here, and I realize that. But I think that trying to figure out a way to have people going into rooms that are scary, and they're scary for everybody, and they kind of should be scary because new things are scary, and handbooks are easier than being outside the box. And having a checklist is a lot simpler than going in sort of informed by an intention to try to come to a shared understanding and not a whole heck of a lot more than that. But I think that trying to figure out a way to communicate to Indigenous and public governments the spirit of the process and the intentions that underpin the process, rather than trying to define the process and what will constitute an adequate process, is necessary, or otherwise, again, you slide back down that slippery slope towards something which can really undermine the very thing you're trying to do by trying too hard to define it. I don't know if that was an answer at all, but that's the best I got this afternoon.
Mark, would you like to comment?
Yeah, touching on that issue of representation, and I think, and the overlap issue, however you want to characterize it, I think the best approach is to really support First Nations in their own nation building, their own nationhood, and self-government, self-determination. Again, I come back to the principle that we had at the start of our process in British Columbia, which is that First Nations have to resolve these issues, and to do that, they need to be supported in their own efforts to build their own nationhood and their own governance. Thank you.
Frank, do you want to comment? Or no? Yes? Oh, go ahead. You don't have to behave.
I'm going to behave since Ross behaved, and we'll leave it at that.
All right.
If I could just add, I think there's other opportunities to get at that issue of priorities. There's direction, for example, with the UN Declaration on National Action Plans. There's the provincial legislation in British Columbia that talks about a plan as well. And I think it's really important that modern treaty nations feed into those plans and help set those priorities. And that's one tool to set those kind of priorities.
I'm not seeing anyone else at the microphone. Are there? Oh, I see someone coming. All right. Go ahead.
Sanuso Then, Nicole Tom Uji. I'm from Little Salmon Carmex First Nation in the Yukon. My question is, can UNDRIP help with co-development where Indigenous representation is at the table in each governmental department discussion where decisions are being made before consultation happens?
I'm not sure if this is an answer, but it's a very important question. I think that goes back to one of the challenges around co-development is getting other departments involved. I pointed out in this new policy for British Columbia that the provincial government has their Ministry of Indigenous Relations as the sort of the frontline ministry on that, without any kind of firm commitment that other agencies will participate. And that's a challenge. And even when there is a commitment to have other agencies and a whole government approach, we rarely see it. It's really difficult, and there's silos, and there's we talk about co-development mandates. There's still some departments that basically don't have much of a mandate at all, and it's the same mandate that's been around for 20 years, and they refuse to change it. So I'm not directly answering your question, but I am just acknowledging it's a real challenge. Thank you.
One of the, over the past couple of days, I was one of the experts in the youth assimilation with the Gordon Foundation. And we were, I'm saying we, the kids were, in their negotiation between Indigenous nation, provincial, and or territorial, and Canada. And there was a lot of old style negotiation stuff. And Larry Ennis was sitting in, and I said, I want to change the dynamic a little. And he said, just let's just wait and see how it goes. So after another hour of the back and forth, he said, yeah, go change it. So I said, I want you guys to now negotiate from the perspective, if this was BC, that we now have UNDRIP legislation, and also realizing that potentially in this next year, we're going to have to prepare, because Canada's going to, they made the commitment to introduce UNDRIP legislation within the next year. How would the negotiation change? Now we're talking about co-development, collaboration, and shared decision-making. Words that came out of the youth's mouths. And the dynamic of that negotiation changed. And a decision was reached based on shared decision-making.
Maybe I could just add, I think if we can make stronger analogies between co-development and FPIC, that should start to create a legal obligation on other agencies and departments to engage. Once that's recognized that these are legal obligations, not just aspirations, I think that will go a long way to making sure that there is a whole government approach on these issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have time for another question. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. My name is Jamie Snook, and I work with two co-management boards set up under the Labrador-Inuit Land Claim Agreement. And I guess part of our frustration over the last decade has been the consistency of disagreement over legal interpretations. So there's two legal concepts that we've put a lot of weight on: the honor of the Crown and the spirit and intent of agreements. And I'm just wondering if the panelists could speak to those two concepts, and if they really do have any weight or not with the Department of Justice and in legal basis, because we certainly refer to them a lot in thinking that they do, but I'm kind of curious to get more of a legal perspective on those two concepts and how they're received internally.
Sure, I can comment briefly. I wouldn't want to opine on what may or may not carry weight in the Department of Justice. If I could answer that question, my job would be a lot easier, probably. Certainly, from my perspective and the perspective of our firm and the work that we do, the honor of the Crown is a critical concept. And I think particularly since the MMF case, which really, from my perspective, breathed life into it as more than just sort of a soft idea which kind of is floating out there but doesn't really mean anything, but transformed it maybe not into a fully formed, hard legal principle, which you could sue for the breach of or whatever else, but certainly in my view, it's increasingly vital and increasingly important as a tool to understand the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous governments. How it works in practice, I mean, it's so contextual. It's a bit hard to offer general guidance about when it's implicated, and if it is implicated, what's that going to mean? But certainly, if the question is, as I understand it to be, are these terms that actually have sort of weight and meaning and vitality from a legal perspective? Absolutely. I think the honor of the Crown absolutely has weight and meaning and vitality, and I think that looking to the spirit and intent of a treaty, whether it's a historic treaty or a modern treaty, is a necessary part of treaty interpretation. I mean, we may have moved from the one-pagers of the 19th century to the 250-pagers of the late 20th and early 21st century, but most of it doesn't make it onto the page, right? There's no way that the relationship and all of the sort of conditions and issues and ideas and intentions are going to make it onto the page. And so certainly I think it's not just a nice idea. It's something which has to inform legal interpretations of treaties, modern and historic. I think it's obviously, you know, the more fulsomely drafted the treaty, the less urgent it may become. And the Little Salmon case sort of talks about some of these issues. But no, I think that they're both important, vital, and meaningful legal principles that certainly inform huge parts of my work, and I'm sure huge parts of the work of lots of the people in the room.
Thank you. Last words, Mark? Mark, yeah.
I would just add that I think we're going to see some interesting developments around the concept of good faith negotiations. There hasn't been a lot of law. I think it kind of got overtaken by the honor of the Crown, but there has been attempts in British Columbia to start to not be so scared of that concept, to start to define it. As the Treaty Commission, I think that's going to put us in an interesting place that we don't want to necessarily be arbiters, but we're going to be on the lookout for when the parties are not acting in good faith. So I think the whole concept of good faith negotiations will be an interesting one and will help, I think, answer some of these questions.
Thank you. We're out of time, unless, Frank, I don't want to cut you off, so thank you. So just a couple things. If you are interested, I've put the slide there, if you are interested in sharing your experience on co-development, my name and email are there. You can also go to the website of the Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project, where we will be happy to hear your views and comments. We're doing interviews and focus group on these issues right now or in the next few months. So some of you may hear from us directly as well, some of you as well. So, and the second thing I want to do is please join me in thanking our panelists for this conversation. I think it was very insightful. Thank you very much. And please stay put. We have closing remarks and I guess announcements that are coming.
Music necessary.
It's our coming up.
Oh yeah, you guys, you're gonna dance off the stage.
Exactly.
So we're almost done day one, and we just have a few more minutes left to go. I think people are trickling in from the other sessions. I wanted to, before I get too far, thank all our conference sponsors. So Government of Canada, Aldridge and Rosling, Pape Salter, and Tallier. That's a tongue twister. Borden Ladner Gervais, Envision Insight Group, Inc., JFK Law Corporation, Gowling WLG, the Firelight Group, Museum of History, Musée Canadien de l'Histoire. How's that for French? From a non-francophone. So just to before I get into the events for this evening, I just wanted to make a couple of comments or summary thoughts on what we heard today. And I know we had a lot of opportunity to hear about experiences across the north, across Canada, just on the challenges of implementation, the going to the courts to enforce our agreements. So you heard about the honor of the Crown. There's still that question of, is the honor of the Crown being upheld, or are we forced to force Canada to uphold the honor of the Crown? So there's some trends, themes that are coming out there. With the thoughts around economic development, you just hear that through our modern treaties, we're able to create economic opportunities, we're able to determine the direction we want our communities to take and put money towards those efforts. You hear some of the Hawaiian experience of being able to direct monies where they see the maximum benefit, and those lessons of being able to focus and not try to do everything at once, but focus their energies and their resources towards something that will have a big impact, that triple bottom line. So there's some great lessons that I think we all try to emulate when we're implementing our agreements. And what resonated with me was that piece about ancient spirit and modern mind, respect, taking care of everything, and being connected. And I think we see that in almost every single one of the presentations. There was a talk of stewardship, about looking forward, future generations, and being that balance between using resources, whether it's forestry or mining, and doing it in a way that's really responsible. And that's really the balance that we have as modern treaty holders, is how do we balance our innate responsibility to take care of our land and our people, our future generations, to that economic responsibility of creating economic opportunities and jobs for our nations, and not completely laying waste to all of the resources in our regions. So there was so many lessons throughout all of the speakers today, and I think it left me with hope, seeing that so many nations are recognizing that balance and taking it seriously, and really putting all of their efforts into realizing that dream of being self-sufficient, self-determining, and forging our own path, and doing it in a good way. So I'm feeling hopeful for tomorrow's presentations. Tonight we have the movie screening, Atautsukut, which is Leaving None Behind, and that's from 6:30 to 7:30 in the Suzor Cote room. And that, I don't have who's sponsoring that, but 100 seats maximum, so if you're interested, please get there early. And then we'll be coming in here afterwards for evening reception with performances and the launch of the Northern Public Affairs special issue. So if you haven't already grabbed your Northern Affairs public issue, there is where it says Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project at that table. You guys want to give a wave there? Yay. At that table, they will be giving every attendee a copy of the NPA that's a special on modern treaty implementation. And then just for tomorrow's sessions, we're back here at 8:30 in the morning. We do have themed breakouts from 10:45 till noon. The coffee for the youth, we will have youth, the session with the youth again at the side. The youth will have reserved tables for lunch, and then we'll have the youth networking session again at the afternoon coffee break. So that's it for logistics. Actually, no, sorry. Silent auction. It's on now. The items are displayed here on the right. You'll see all of the artisans, the vendors at the front have donated pieces. All the proceeds go to Silatanique Youth Engagement Program. And it's on now. It closes at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, so you have lots of time to bid on some nice items. And just a reminder, all of the sessions have note takers. The proceedings and the PowerPoints will be posted on the LCAC website. And that's it. We'll see you guys at the movie and then here at the reception afterwards. Thank you.
Just